Well, hello, my friends. It is Monday, the 6th of May, and I've got Barry Ritholtz joining me. Our conversation starts at 48 minutes. I got really carried away with the headlines and clips, but I think that it was all worth it. I'd love to know what you think. The best news recap in the business for any daily podcast out there, I could tell you that. But yeah, I hope you have a long drive or you really have nothing else to listen to if you want to recap this news with me. A lot of headlines, analysis, and the whole list of winners of the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Friday. I deliver it over music for some reason. I'm telling you, I got carried away. I hope you had a great weekend. I was very busy doing some amazing things. Thank you very much to longtime listener Sean McKellop of the Maryland State Education Association for inviting me to give the keynote speech on Saturday morning to an amazing, super impressive group of education support professionals who range from instructional assistants to cafeteria workers, custodians, bus drivers, secretaries, and so much more. It was really, really amazing to speak with them in Towson, Maryland on Saturday morning. So rewarding, and I sat down with about 5 of them and did interviews that I'll share with you at some point, hopefully during this week. But it was really rewarding and inspiring, and I had a great time with those guys, and I can't wait for you to meet them right here on the podcast. Then I drove from Maryland to Shepherdstown, West Virginia, where I am now through Wednesday because I'm hosting and moderating a really cool little mini conference hosted by the National Conservation Training Center, my friends here at the Fish and Wildlife Agency, this beautiful federal government facility. And it's also being co-produced and presented by Oberlin College's David Orr and the Climate Democracy Initiative Headwaters Camp, Conservation, Climate, and Democracy. From today till Wednesday, I'll be down here in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. Hopefully I'll be banking some great interviews with some of the awesome guests at this conference as well. So a busy weekend for me and week for me, but I'll be pumping out the podcast in addition each and every day. So thank you so much for your support. I cannot do it, obviously, without you. This podcast is ad-free and fully supported by listeners like you. If you haven't signed up for a subscription and you listen to the show, please do. Please sign up now, patreon.com/Pete Dominic. All right, let's get to your headlines and some sound bites. I got a whole bunch for you here on Monday, recapping the week. Let's start with Friday. How about that? Recapping the weekend, I should say. The U.S. economy on Friday added 175,000 jobs for April, a slowdown apparently compared with recent months. The unemployment rate, however, remains low. Do you have a job? Do you know anybody struggling to get a job? Let us know if we can help here at Stand Up. Email me, standupwithpete@gmail.com. Also on Friday, President Biden gave out the Presidential Medal of Freedom to 19 people, including a whole bunch of political colleagues that he's worked with over his career and many others, artists and actors. You know what? Let me read them all to you. How about that? And how about some inspiring Presidential Medal of Freedom music? A couple of his political allies over his career got the Medal of Honor. Of course, Nancy Pelosi was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. I said Medal of Honor. Medal of Freedom, much different medal. Secretary of State John Kerry, he got it, and he's the guy who lost to George W. Bush president. Remember that? I like John Kerry. Congressman James Clyburn of South Carolina, he's the guy that basically helped Joe Biden get elected when he supported him in South Carolina primary when he was running against Pete Buttigieg. Also getting the Presidential Medal of Freedom, former Vice President Al Gore, former Mayor Mike Bloomberg. The one well-known Republican to be honored was Senator Elizabeth Dole of North Carolina. By the way, the Medal of Freedom was established in its current form by President John F. Kennedy, meant to honor, quote, any person who has made an especially meritorious contribution to national security, world peace, or cultural or significant public or private endeavors. That's how the original executive order put it. Aside from political recipients, the president selected a handful of well-known figures from the world of civil rights, sports, entertainment, and space exploration. Among the honorees, Clarence B. Jones, a civil rights activist who helped draft the I Have a Dream speech delivered by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at the March on Washington in 1963. Opal Lee, an educator who in 2016 at age 89 walked from her home in Texas to Washington to lobby to make Juneteenth the federally recognized holiday marking the end of slavery. Also, Judy Shepard got the Presidential Medal of Freedom. She, of course, was Matthew Shepard's mother and found the Matthew Shepard Foundation to combat anti-gay hate crimes after her son was so brutally murdered in 1998. I remember that. It was horrific. Others recognized for the Presidential Medal of Freedom, including Reverend Gregory J. Boyle, a Jesuit priest and the founder of Homeboy Industries, the gang intervention and rehabilitation program active in Los Angeles. Teresa Romero is the president of the United Farm Workers and the first Latina to lead a national union. And the cultural and athletic figures honored were Michelle Yeoh, the first Asian to win the Academy Award for Best Actress, Katie Ledecky, the greatest female swimmer of all time, 7-time Olympic gold medal winner, and Phil Donahue. Phil Donahue got the Presidential Medal of Freedom for being a pioneer of daytime talk shows and probably the harbinger of other horrible daytime talk shows that got a lot worse, and then reality shows. And, well, anyway, congrats. Phil Donahue was against the Iraq War, so I always gave him credit for that. A lot of people think his show got canceled from MSNBC for that reason. And finally, the president also selected a couple trailblazing figures from the space field. Astronaut Ellen Ochoa, the first Hispanic woman to leave the planet, and second female director of NASA's Johnson Space Center, and the astronomer Jane Rigby got the Presidential Medal of Freedom. She's the chief scientist of the James Webb Space Telescope, and 3 awardees received the medal posthumously. It's Medgar Evers, of course, a civil rights leader who was murdered in 1963, shocked the nation and galvanized the movement to end racial discrimination, which we're still working really hard at. Jim Thorpe, the first Native American to win an Olympic gold medal, and former Senator Frank R. Lautenberg, Democrat of New Jersey and longtime colleague of President Biden's in Congress. There was your Presidential Medals of Freedom for 2024. Hope that was worth it. And now let's get to more serious and kind of depressing news, which is a lot of the headlines, as always, but we will get through it together. Federal prosecutors accuse Congressman Henry Cuellar, a Texas Democrat, and his wife of participating in a years-long bribery scheme. He denied the allegations. We'll see what happens with that. The Kentucky Derby took place on Saturday. Did you pay attention to that? Did you go to a Derby party? I know some of you are into that. I'm not particularly into it. I feel like it's not nice for the horses. I have a hard time watching that. All those affluent folks hanging out watching these horses be what abused. I was reading about it in the New York Times. Sorry to poo-poo it for those of you that love it, but why do racehorses die was the question. As beautiful as a thoroughbred is in full flight, the legs that seemingly rarely touch the ground are fragile. Ankles the size of Coke bottles and hooves the size of crystal ashtray propel a 1,200-pound thoroughbred at speeds up to 35 miles per hour. So that could be one thing. But it's a multi-billion-dollar economy and an important part of American history, of course, horse racing. And apparently it was a thrilling finish, according to the article I'm reading. A long shot named Mystic Dan held off a late charge by Sierra Leone and a colt from Japan named Forever Young Saturday to win the 150th running of the Kentucky Derby, America's oldest major continuing sporting event, bringing to a close a much-needed casualty-free week of thoroughbred racing. Apparently there weren't any injuries or deaths. A welcome conclusion, they say, for the multi-billion-dollar sport imperiled by frequent racing fatalities, reckless breeding, dodgy doping practices, and the old-fashioned greed of veterinarians, trainers, and owners. Last year, 12 horses perished at Churchill Downs in the days surrounding the famous race, and it only got worse 2 weeks later. A horse trained by one of the sport's most recognized trainers died at the race course. And so there you go. There's your Kentucky Derby. Sorry to make that sad if you enjoyed that. In other news, let's move on. The Washington Post had a great roundup of the campus protests, where schools are continuing to grapple with balancing students' free speech rights and maintaining an amicable atmosphere ahead of graduation ceremonies, which were underway this weekend at universities across the country, including some that have been roiled by pro-Palestinian protests and police clashes. At the University of Southern California, Los Angeles, police pushed some protesters off campus early Sunday, locked a gate afterward, according to a student newspaper. Graduation ceremonies being held yesterday at campuses including Ohio State University and Northeastern University in Boston. On Saturday, roughly 75 student protesters marched through the University of Michigan's commencement ceremony held at Michigan Stadium. University of Florida has held commencement ceremonies at 2/3 of its 17 colleges and has not experienced any disruptions, according to University President Ben Sass. New York Mayor Eric Adams was asked on ABC's This Week on Sunday whether colleges in the city will be able to hold peaceful in-person graduation ceremonies. He said, "I believe they should." More than 2,300 people have been arrested on campuses nationwide over the past 2 weeks, according to a count kept by the Washington Post. At the University of Virginia on Saturday, authorities arrested 25 pro-Palestinian demonstrators during a sustained confrontation. Several colleges and universities are negotiating deals with students to try to diffuse tensions peacefully and avert further violence. Thus far, Rutgers, Northwestern, Brown, the University of Minnesota, and University of California at Riverside are some of the colleges that have struck deals. Students have been calling for universities to divest from their investments in Israel Israel and companies supporting the war in Israel. And let's stick to the Middle East because huge story yesterday's scoop that Axios got. The Biden administration apparently last week put a hold on a shipment of U.S.-made ammunition to Israel. And this is big. This is a big deal because it's the first time since the October 7th attack that U.S. has stopped a weapons shipment intended for the Israeli military. The incident has raised serious concerns inside the Israeli government and sent officials scrambling to understand why the shipment was held. President Biden facing sharp criticism, of course, among Americans who oppose his support of the country's war in Gaza. Biden administration, of course, and the rest of the international community highly concerned Israel will invade the southern Gaza city of Rafah, where more than 1 million displaced Palestinians have been taking shelter. Other huge news coming out of Israel. Apparently, Israel's cabinet voted to shut down the offices of the Al Jazeera network operating in the country with immediate effect. The headline, Israel raids Al Jazeera office as Netanyahu government votes to shut channel down. And I saw this headline from an Israeli outlet, Haaretz.com. Netanyahu hoped Hamas would reject the ceasefire offer. When it didn't, he turned to sabotage. Israel's criminal defendant prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, more focused on saving his incompetent far-right government than saving the hostages who have spent 7 months trapped in Gaza, is doing everything he can to torpedo Israel's last and best chance at bringing the hostages home. A scathing analysis from the Haaretz reporters there. Apparently, the head of the CIA, Bill Burns, is in the Middle East negotiating. He is in first Doha and now he's going to Israel today, Monday. So we'll see what happens with that. The prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, the disgraced prime minister, I should say, addressed Israel yesterday and said, if we don't protect ourselves, no one will. We cannot trust the promises of Gentiles. David Rothkopf tweeted about that. Seems like some anti-Gentilism to me. Yeah, you think? He also said it's impossible to be pro-Israel and pro-Netanyahu. And I agree with that as well. I don't know about you. All right, 2 more articles I just want to mention and read from. I hope I'm not boring you. I think this stuff is obviously really interesting and important. I saw this reporting from NBC News titled, The Demographics of Migration to the United States Are Rapidly Shifting. And I just wanted to read just from the first part of it because I thought it was super fascinating to find out who is now coming to the U.S. and from where. They report here at NBC News, 3 names on the byline. Jacumba Hot Springs, California. Shortly after dawn in the desert east of San Diego, a group of migrants huddled around a campfire. They had come together on this desolate stretch of the U.S.-Mexico border from 4 different continents. Young men from India shared snacks with women from Nicaragua, while a man from the country of Georgia stood next to a family from Brazil. A volunteer with a local humanitarian group hauled over a beverage cooler filled with papers, legal information printed in 22 different languages. As he handed them out in Gujarati, Spanish, Portuguese, and Russian, he said, "Welcome to the United States of America." This is the new normal of migration to the southern border. What was once mostly a regional phenomenon has become truly global, with the share of migrants coming from the 4 closest countries dropping. The 4 closest countries, those 4 countries, it's fewer people are coming from those 4 countries. I'm just explaining this just in case you're not hearing it. And the number from elsewhere around the world is increasing. And I think that's super important, which is why I wanted to read this NBC News analysis. Newly released data from the Department of Homeland Security shows a fundamental shift. Before the pandemic, roughly 9 in 10 migrants crossing the border illegally, that is between ports of entry, came from Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, the 4 countries closest to the border. Those countries no longer hold the majority. As of 2023, the first time since the U.S. has collected such data, half of all migrants who cross the border now come from elsewhere globally. The greatest numbers have come from countries further away than the Americas that have never before sent migrants to the border at this scale. In 2019 fiscal year, the number of Colombians apprehended illegally crossing the border was 400. 2023 exploded to 150,000, nearly 400-fold increase. But they come, too, from countries in Africa, Eastern Europe, and every region in Asia. There's been a dramatic increase in the number of migrants from the world's most populous countries. The number of migrants from China and India grew more than 11 and 5-fold, respectively. And some countries that previously sent negligible numbers of migrants to the U.S. border have been seeing staggering increases. A global shift in the share of migrants crossing the U.S. border. I thought that was really interesting and wanted to mention that. And this, another story, completely different, but I think also interesting because after years of delay, Boeing, we've heard a lot about them, they're going to try again to send this space capsule off into space. That's where they go. Space capsules. The planned launch for today comes as the aerospace giant dealing with fallout from problems in its airline division.
The Washington Post writes, before a door-sized panel blew out of a Boeing 737, leaving a gaping hole in the side of an Alaska Airlines aircraft shortly after takeoff, before whistleblowers came forward to say they were threatened for bringing up safety issues at the company, and before the Justice Department opened a criminal investigation in the blowout incident, well, Boeing was struggling with another set of issues on another high-profile vehicle. Its Starliner spacecraft, designed to fly astronauts to orbit under $4.2 billion contract from NASA, has suffered a series of problems that put its launch with astronauts years behind schedule. Its onboard computer had failed during its first test flight. Second test flight was scrubbed after valves in the vehicle's service module stuck and wouldn't operate. Then, after the craft finally flew mission successfully without anyone on board, Boeing discovered that tape used as insulation on wiring inside the capsule was flammable and would need to be removed. The parachute system also had problems, forced the company to redesign and strengthen a link between the parachutes and the spacecraft. So, a decade after NASA awarded Boeing a contract to fly astronauts to the International Space Station, Boeing's finally going to attempt to fly its Starliner spacecraft with people on board. If all goes as planned, that's going to happen 10:34 p.m. tonight, May 6th, 2024. We will be watching. Well, I'll probably be working, but maybe you'll be watching as a result of me mentioning that story. Finally, severe weather in Houston. High waters flooded neighborhoods around Houston Saturday following heavy rains that have already resulted in crews rescuing more than 400 people from homes, rooftops, and roads engulfed in murky water. I wanted to make sure I mentioned you folks down there. I hope you're okay. If you're listening, your family members and friends, as always, let us know if you're dealing with some weather-related issues in your area. We want to know about it here at Stand Up and want to know how we can support you in the stand-up community, as we're all probably going to be dealing with these increasingly in the future. Those are your headlines, and now I still have a whole bunch of sound bites from the weekend and Sunday shows, including some comedy for you at the end, as always. But let me know if I read a little bit more today than I normally do. Let me know if you like that or if you don't like that. standupwithpete@gmail.com. All right, let's start with some fun clips from, I don't know if they're fun, but you've got two well-known actors on TV. I think both of these, MSNBC over the weekend, they like to do that. First, let's go to Jeff Daniels, who sat down at the table on MSNBC. Morning Joe, I think, is the show he was on. And this is what the Michigan native had to say about the election and the stakes. The great Jeff Daniels, of course, who starred in Aaron Sorkin's The Newsroom. He has a new show on Netflix called A Man in Full. Here he is on MSNBC talking about the current situation.
And gaslighting. We've normalized that.
It's certainly deeply timely. So as you sat down, we were talking about the connection that this has to today's politics, also because class is such a big part of this story. Mm-hmm. And connected to our last conversation, class is going to be a big part of this election. And Michigan, state you're from, you live in, you know so well, might even be the tipping point state this time around. Both candidates spending a lot of time there. How do you see all of these issues connection, including class, shaping how voters go to the polls in what's going to be a very tight race?
Well, class, yes, but what stretches over class, I think, is decency and honesty and values and principles. I mean, we live in the Midwest. We don't necessarily take New York and L.A. as seriously as New York and L.A. takes itself. You know, I hate to tell you, but we're flyover country, and we got a chip on our shoulder about that. And we're not as stupid as people like Trump in particular think we are. He talks down to us. He talks past us. He lies to us. And we get it. And it's really not the people on the right. They're gonna stay there. You know, okay, terrific. Class or no class, they're gonna stay there. The left's gonna stay on the left. It's that 20%, 15% in the middle, the Reagan Democrats, the moderate Republicans who are going, I'm over Trump, maybe Nikki Haley. I'm over, get me somebody. But basically, I think even the middle of the country, even Michigan, is watching the Republican Party destroy itself. But there are two wars going on. I see the war within the Republican Party, which we're all standing back going, knock yourselves out. And then there's the war for democracy, which is going on right now, and it's on the internet, it's on social media, it's on people not listening anymore. But that war is going to culminate in November, and I think that's when the voters. And I'm cautiously optimistic that the people in the middle, the people in states like Michigan, are going to go, you know what, we're better than this. I'm going to vote for Biden, even though he's old. which also translates into wise and wisdom, which we may need right now, because the election that I really want to vote on is the one in 2028, when people are now running with a future. All those folks.
All right, Jeff Daniels. I don't know if his analysis is perfectly accurate or if I fully agree with it, but I certainly like hearing him deliver it, even off script. He's a pretty smart guy. I interviewed him back in the day. He's a real nice guy, real smart guy. I like that a lot. Also, De Niro, who I spent a little time with recently, got to meet him at Glenn Kirshner's Justice Matters event, got to introduce Ava to him, and he held that event ostensibly to just talk about Trump and go crazy and support all these people who want justice for this country and for Donald Trump. Anyway, he was on MSNBC with Stephanie Ruhle, and he did like a longer interview. I'll just give you a couple of minutes because this never gets old to hear De Niro talking about Trump and America.
Over the last 8 years, we've heard you talk about the former president. You have called him a fraud, a con artist. You've said he's a New Yorker like you, and you have watched this brand of BS for decades. And despite that, he became president. And now we're watching him 10 blocks from where we are right now, sitting in a courtroom as a criminal defendant. What do you think about that?
I think of how absurd it is. And this might be the one case where that could be it for him. It's a state case. It's the least important in many ways, and yet it's the one that could be tried and finished in well enough time for people to just take that in.
Does it give you some sense, not of joy, but of relief at least, that he's potentially facing some consequences? Because as you've said before, this guy's a con artist and he's gotten away with it for years.
No, he's more than that to me. He's sick. He is really, genuinely a sick person that somehow has been allowed into our system. And I'm tired of calling him names. He just can't be anywhere near the office of the presidency.
You've played a lot of bad guys. Would you ever play Donald Trump?
Never. There's nothing about him. There's not one redeeming thing in him that I can see ever. And it's funny, I was just thinking that he actually became president. He could have done good things. Instead, he had to do it all wrong. He's so, as we all know, so narcissistic and self-centered.
Yeah, well, it went on like that, and it doesn't get old. But I want to get to a couple of other clips. Jeff Daniels and Robert De Niro soften us up, because now we got to go to this train wreck of a conversation between CBS Face the Nation's Margaret Brennan, who was absolutely incredulous during a conversation with the current South Dakota governor, Kristi Noem, who wants to be Trump's running mate, who obviously has been in the news because she killed her puppy and wrote about it infamously. She said she shot and killed her, quote, less than worthless 14-month-old puppy, Cricket, for being, quote, aggressive. And she dug the hole deeper for herself on Sunday on CBS. Let's listen to some of it.
On this point, though, because you have been rumored to be a potential vice presidential candidate, as you know, and former House Speaker Newt Gingrich said killing the dog and then writing about it ended any possibility of her being picked as VP. You talk multiple times about it. In fact, at the end of the book, you say the very first thing you would do if you got to the White House that was different from Joe Biden is you'd make sure Joe Biden's dog was nowhere on the grounds. Commander, say hello to Cricket.
Jesus.
Are you doing this to try to look tough? Do you still think that you have a shot at being a VP?
Well, number one, Joe Biden's dog has attacked 24 Secret Service people. So how many people is enough people to be attacked and dangerously hurt before you make a decision on a dog and what to do with it?
Well, he's not living at the White House
That's
anymore.
a question that the president should be held accountable to.
You're saying he should be
shot? That's what the president should be accountable to, is what is the number? And I would say about Republicans criticizing me, these are the same Republicans that criticized me during COVID. They've criticized me when I've made other decisions in South Dakota to protect my state. And my state today is extremely happy and thriving. We're doing well. We've got thousands of people moving to our state.
But if that wasn't bad enough, the South Dakota governor and vice presidential hopeful then
generated more controversy. Several stories, apparently, that have been completely debunked and inaccurate in her new book. And in a testy clash on Face the Nation, Margaret Brennan pressed the governor over a false claim that she met with Kim Jong-un, a claim which her team seemed to lay at the feet of the book's ghostwriter and editor, which is pretty weird. I mean, you hear her say it was brought to my attention. Brought to your attention? It's your book. Didn't you read your book? You read the apparently audiobook version of it? Anyway, here's a little bit of that super awful, weird exchange, but good job by CBS's Margaret Brennan as usual.
So you write about lessons learned in leadership, and you bring up some specific incidents I want to ask you about. You talk about meeting some world leaders, and one specific one, quote, I remember when I met with North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un, I'm sure he underestimated me, having no clue about my experience staring down little tyrants. I've been a children's pastor after all. Did you meet Kim Jong-un?
Well, you know, as soon as this was brought to my attention, I certainly made some changes and looked at this passage. And I've met with many, many world leaders. I've traveled around the world. As soon as it was brought to my attention, we went forward and have made some edits. So I'm glad that this book is being released in a couple of days and that those edits will be in place and that people will have the updated version.
So you did not meet with Kim Jong-un. That's what you're saying.
No, I've met with many, many world leaders. I've traveled around the world. I think I've talked extensively in this book about my time serving in Congress, my time as governor, before governor, some of the travels that I've had. I'm not going to talk about my specific meetings with world leaders. I'm just not going to do that.
Okay.
This anecdote shouldn't have been in the book, and as soon as it was brought to my attention, I made sure that was adjusted. So the book is not released until Tuesday, and so we're doing all that we can to make sure that those changes are made, and I'm going to continue to focus on what this book is and the blueprint that it lays out for the American citizen on all of the things in the background and stories of my life, but also what I think that needs to be identified in politics and what's broken today. I talk about how broken the money game is, how broken it is that we've got consultants that are getting rich off of elected officials, and then how fake some elected politicians are.
Like you.
Every single person in this country wants someone in elected office that's a human being that doesn't say they're perfect.
Unlike you.
I take responsibility for that being in the book, and as soon as it was brought to my attention, I asked for it to be changed. So I'm glad that the release date is in a couple of days, and we're excited to talk to America about my new book, No Going Back.
Oh, there it is.
So you talk about your time in the Armed Services Committee from 2013 to 2015. In that period of time, the leader of South Korea was a female president. I'm wondering, who is it that you confused Kim Jong-un with?
I think you need to remember, Margaret, and everybody needs to remember that I've worked on ag policy and federal policy for over 30 years. My time in serving and making policies in this country has been extensive and covered decades.
Right, but you never went to North Korea. I make no
specifics in this book. I talk about the fact that, yes, I have. I've been there. So
you went to North Korea?
You went to the DMZ, and there are details in this book that talk about going to the DMZ and specifics that I'm willing to share. There's some specifics I'm not willing to share with you. I've traveled the world, and I visited with world leaders, and some of that is referenced in the book, and this anecdote is something that, when it was brought to my attention, we made some changes, and when the book's released, we'll do all that we can to see that is reflected.
It goes on, by the way. It goes on. Yeah, it's bad. And she eventually goes after Margaret Brennan, of course. That's what they always do. But Bill B. actually tweeted, I'm just sitting here wondering what percentage of Asian men Kristi Noem thinks are Kim Jong-un. All right, here's another disgraceful interview from one of the corporate media Sunday shows. This is Meet the Press. It's Kirsten Welker, and she had Governor Tim Scott, another Trump surrogate, and another guy who wants to be Trump's VP on her show, and he refused to say that he would accept the results of the 2024 election. Of course, this question being asked because over the weekend, former disgraced President Donald Trump refused to make that commitment. So here is another really embarrassing display from another wannabe Donald Trump VP. What a terrible aspiration.
for any American, but especially for a woman or a person of color. Anyway, listen to this brutal train wreck.
All right, well, let's talk about some of the headlines this week. In an interview, Mr. Trump this week again would not commit to accepting the election results of 2024 if he loses. He still hasn't conceded the last election. You, of course, did vote to certify the 2020 election results, and you've said, quote, it was not stolen. Why would you join a ticket with someone who believes the exact opposite on this critical point?
Well, I think we have to listen to what President Trump said and not what the reporters said that he actually said. Here's one of the things that he's been very clear, and even talking about the situation in Wisconsin, what he said was he expects there to be an honest election. He expects the results to be clear and for him to be successful. I expect him to be successful as well. There's no doubt that when you look at the polls across our country, the one thing that is crystal clear, that the American people now having a contrast between 4 years of Joe Biden versus 4 years of Donald Trump, they're really excited to get back to the Trump years. And so I expect the election to be fair, and I expect Donald Trump to be our next president.
In terms of what he said, he specifically said, if it's not fair, as you're saying, you have to fight for the right of the country. And just this week, he said that he won Wisconsin. Falsely, Senator. So, again, to the point, you voted to certify the election results of 2020. It's the exact opposite of what you said and did after 2020. Why would you want to be on a ticket with someone where there's such a fundamental difference?
There is clear facts here. President Trump himself said he expects this election to be fair, he expects it to be honest, and he expects to win. That's what the presidential candidate should expect, and I expect the exact same thing. And frankly, the American people agree with him. This is an issue that is not an issue, so I'm not going to make it an issue.
Well, Senator, will you commit to accepting the election results of 2024? Bottom line.
Well, at the end of the day, the 47th president of the United States will be President Donald Trump, and I'm excited to get back to low inflation, low unemployment.
Wait, Senator, yes or no? Yes or no? Will you accept the election results of 2024 no matter who wins?
That is my statement.
but is it just yes or no? Will you accept the election results of 2024?
Wow.
I look forward to President Trump being the 47th president. Kristen, you can ask him multiple times.
Senator, just a yes or no answer.
So the American people will make the decision.
But I don't hear you committing
for President Trump. That's clear.
I don't hear you committing to the election results.
Here's the challenge.
Will you commit to accepting the election results?
So many.
All right, here it comes. This is where the guest, the Republican, almost always blames the reporter for asking a perfectly legitimate question, not getting an answer, and then says somehow it's political. Here we go.
This is why so many Americans believe that NBC is an extension of the Democrat Party. At the end of the day, I've said what I've said, and I know that the American people, their voices will be heard, and I believe that President Trump will be our next president. It's that simple.
But, Senators, you know, the hallmark of our democracy is that both candidates agree to a peaceful transfer of power. So I'm asking you, as a potential VP nominee, will you accept to commit to the election results in this election cycle, no matter who wins? Just simply yes or no.
I expect President Trump to win the next election. Listen, I'm not going to answer your hypothetical question when, in fact, I believe the American people are speaking today on the results of the election. And if it continues for the next 6 months, we find ourselves in a great position where we get back to another century of American prosperity. Yeah. I'm looking forward to that.
All right. Let me ask you.
6 times she asked him. 6 times. That is my statement, he said. That is my statement. Wajid Ali tweets about that. The GOP is now an insurrectionist party, and its leaders are committed to authoritarian rule. There is no both sides here. Tim Scott sinks even lower. Shameful. Tara Setmeyer. Tim Scott is an absolute embarrassment. Kyle Griffin. Tim Scott just refused 6 times to commit to accepting the results of the 2024 presidential election. Grant Stern. Tim Scott goes full insurrectionist during his tryout in Trump's Veep stakes. And finally, Harry Sisson tweets, Tim Scott is a spineless coward. He would not commit to accepting the election results in 2024. Dodge the question every single time. This is MAGA. They don't care about our democracy and our country. One more, said Mehdi Hassan. Tim Scott is no moderate. Don't let the amiable, friendly demeanor fool you. you. He's a far-right extremist, Trumpist, and now election denier. So there you go. And guess what? There's one more guy who's trying out and who's a surrogate for Trump. He was on CNN, and he was up against the always fair but tough Jake Tapper. Here is the governor of now North Dakota. Things went sideways on him. His eyebrows look like they're wearing him. Here's Doug Burgum, also destroying his family name and embarrassing himself because of what he says to grovel to one of the grossest human beings ever to walk the face of the earth, and certainly our country. Doug Burgum kissing Trump's ass.
There's something else Donald Trump said in an interview with the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel and also with Time Magazine. He's refusing to commit to accepting the results of the 2024 election. He told the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, quote, "If everything's honest, I'll gladly accept the results. I don't change on that. If it's not, you have to fight for the right of the country," echoing language he used on January 6th. When Time Magazine asked him about potential violence if he loses, he said, quote, "If we don't win, it depends." Now, you called the violence on January 6th reprehensible, and you said it does not represent American values. Donald Trump is openly discussing right now pardoning all of the January 6th criminals. I think that you heard a song from them last night at the fundraiser. And those criminals, by the way, include those who have been convicted in an American court of violently attacking police. He's talking about pardoning them, and he seems to be leaving the door open to potential violence if he loses again. Based on comments you've made in the past, that must concern you.
Well, I think the bigger context here, Jake, is really about elections in America. I mean, you go back in my lifetime, when 1960, it came down to one county. We talk about an election like it's one thing in our country, but elections are still run at the state, the county, and the precinct level. And in Cook County, it was very close between Kennedy and Nixon conceded. In 2000, they've made movies about it, and that election was contested for 2 months in the courts afterwards. And it was, came down to Broward County and some hanging chads. In 2016, this network and many others challenged the results of the 26, falsely claiming that there was Russian interference.
We never challenged the results of the election.
There's plenty of stories supporting that.
I'm talking about the violent interaction that you yourself have decried.
Yes, well, I'm looking forward to next January when Vice President Harris certifies the election for Donald Trump. I mean, the American people are the ones that get to decide these elections, but for both parties and for all Americans, we've got to make sure that every county, every precinct is beyond reproach, that everybody can be confident in our country. In North Dakota, we're doing that. Nobody's questioning the results of an election in any county or precinct in North Dakota. It can be done. It's done all over the nation, except in some cases, we've got, we could have a handful of counties that this election could turn on again, and we've just got to make sure that when it's done, both sides feel good about how it was counted.
Do you believe Joe Biden won the 2020 election?
I believe that Joe Biden won the 2020 election, but I also, based on the number of votes that were in, but I think that because of COVID, there was a huge number of irregularities because we changed a bunch of rules in certain places, in certain precincts, in certain states. And the number of mail-out ballots, not mail-in. We do absentee ballots in North Dakota. We do make sure we're verifying signatures. But when you're mailing out more ballots than there are people that are actually on the registers for the voting rolls, that creates a massive moral hazard. And then when you've got unmonitored drop boxes and a bunch of single bullet votes that only vote for one candidate, I think all of us have to say, is that the way we want to have elections?
I don't know what you're talking about.
So I think that 2020 was a special case.
I mean, you agree with
a single bullet vote is a ballot that comes in where it's very unusual to get that many ballots where someone just votes for president and not for anybody else down ballot. That's what I'm talking about.
Attorney General Bill Barr said that there was no significant fraud that would have changed the results of the 2020 election. Do you disagree with that, or do you agree with that?
Well, again, we're talking about, what are you talking about? What happened before the ballots came in or after they came out?
About the results of the 2020
we counted up all the ballots and this. Yeah, and I'm saying, I just said it. I think that there was a special set of circumstances around COVID where we did things like we've never done before. The millions of mail-out ballots was a new thing for America. And when you mail out more ballots and they just go out to, I know people in states where they got 3 ballots mailed to them. That's a problem, and we should all be concerned about that. But I'm looking forward. We're talking about making sure that the 2024 election is secure, and there's no need to keep relitigating 2020.
All right. Well, of course there is, because Donald Trump relitigates it every day on social media and near every microphone. He's constantly talking about it and constantly still lying about it, and it led to an insurrection. Of course, we need to keep talking about it. That's Doug Burgum embarrassing himself on CNN with Jake Tapper yesterday. Now, here's Republican Congressman Dan Crenshaw. He's no super thoughtful guy himself, but he's not as extreme as some of his colleagues, many of his colleagues in the House, although he is really very extreme on so many issues, and a hypocrite when he talks about other people this way. Nonetheless, here he is going after Marjorie Taylor Greene on Fox News with Neil Cavuto on Saturday. The question, the subject is, are they going to recall? They're going to get rid of Speaker Mike Johnson? Are there votes there? Anyway, he doesn't really pull his punches here.
Spotlight, it's been a little while, and maybe one last ditch effort to get a little attention is what she's looking for. There's not a lot of support for this. I don't know how many members would actually vote for it. I do know it won't pass. I think that's been made pretty clear that there's a very, very large and strong majority that will table the motion, meaning it just reverses it so that we don't even vote on it. And it's based in what exactly? That Mike Johnson brought bills to the floor that were necessary for our national security, that the vast majority of members wanted to vote on. So allowing the democratic process to move forward, our process that we have in our Constitution to move forward is apparently the crime of the century, according to these people, which warrants a motion to vacate. Here's the problem. This happened with McCarthy too. And they say that they're siding with Democrats about this uniparty. The real uniparty, by the way, is very clearly between the far left and the far right. And if they had their way, based on the votes they take, this is what would happen. We would have no military. It would be defunded. We'd have no government. It would also be defunded. We'd have no intelligence agencies. We wouldn't be able to collect intelligence on our adversaries, foreign spies, terrorists, what have you. And they'd let Putin win in Ukraine and be on the border of former NATO countries. So just to lay out the reality of what their voting record would actually be. It's not a good one. And so they're so mad about that they want a motion to vacate the speaker. Now, what they do is they make it impossible for the speaker to actually have leverage over Democrats and get things that we want, like border security. Marjorie Taylor Greene has never tried to lay out a plan to get border security done along with the supplemental package. I've done that. I worked for months to do that. A lot of us did. She has never. Tom Massey has never done anything on that front. She's never written any legislation on asylum reform or anything to do with border security. A lot of us have. And so they make it impossible for us to have any leverage with our very slim majority. And then they turn around and punish the speaker when they can't actually make a deal that we want. And then they say, it was all their fault. And now the real patriots are taking over. It's a game, and voters have to stop falling for it.
All right. So I'll put you down as a maybe on what she's considering.
All right. Neil Cavuto. That was funny. Okay, so let's get to one more serious and important clip before we get to the comedy, and that is Senator Mark Kelly. He's up in a tough fight for re-election in Arizona, and he was also on NBC with Kirsten Welker, and I thought this is really important, and maybe I feel like it didn't get enough attention in my news scan, but maybe that's just me. He says he would get around the filibuster if reelected to codify women's reproductive rights into the Constitution, into law, rather. Here he is, former astronaut, husband of Gabby Giffords, and the senator from Arizona.
I think women in Arizona have been through a really tough time, and it all goes back to Donald Trump's election and what he said he wants to do to Roe v. Wade. He recently said he broke it. This is all on him. That women in the state of Arizona don't have the rights that they previously had. Women cannot get the health care they need in this state right now. We have an opportunity in November to sort of fix this at the state level with a ballot initiative. What we really need is national legislation to codify a women's rights to make these decisions. And that's only going to happen and get signed into law if Joe Biden is reelected president.
Would you support getting rid of the filibuster in order to support abortion rights to codify Roe v. Wade into law?
Yes.
You would?
Yeah, I would. Yeah, and when we were looking at voting rights legislation, I voted for that as well. I spent 15 years at NASA flying the space shuttle. If NASA had the rules of the United States Senate, the rocket ship would never leave the launch pad. So at times, at the appropriate time, I think this is one of them, I would consider, changing those rules to make sure that women can get the health care they need.
All right, Senator Mark Kelly. I like it. I like it a lot. I thought that was real good. And now it's time to get to some laughs. Let's start with Colin Jost and Michael Che at SNL's Weekend Update.
Jost. Well, it's the first show of spring, so we'll start tonight with puppy murder. In a new book, South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem revealed that she once shot a dog that was untrainable. That's insane. If a dog is untrainable, you don't shoot it, you give it to President Biden.
All right.
MAGA insiders are saying that Noem, seen here wearing the hair of that dog,
oh dear,
now has zero chance of being Trump's running mate. But I don't know, something tells me Trump would fully support killing disobedient pets.
It's a picture of Mike Pence.
Insiders said that during his hush money trial, Donald Trump complained that none of his supporters were in court with him. But that's not true. What about all those cops?
Former President Donald Trump seen here definitely not sleeping.
It's a picture
Probably just praying.
Picture of his eyes closed looking down in court.
Former President Trump, for the first time in his trial, wrote a message on a yellow Post-it note and handed it to his lawyer while he was making an argument. The Post-it read simply, "Can't pay you."
Officials at Columbia University complained that protesters broke windows and destroyed school property. But so what? College kids also do that when they win the Final Four. Also, you're a university. If you really don't want students to freak out, stop telling them the truth. That's my advice for school and relationships.
Hey,
President
now.
Biden said that the National Guard should not be called in to deal with campus protests, but I'm just happy that he's finally not sending military aid somewhere.
Really?
That was my best joke, Colin.
Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene said next week she will force a vote to oust House Speaker Mike Johnson. And if there's one thing I bet she's amazing at, it's driving men away.
During a campaign event marking the start of Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, President Biden criticized Japan as being xenophobic, which is crazy because why would the Japanese be scared of foreigners?
Oh, picture of a mushroom cloud.
Oh my God, Drake just dropped another diss record, guys. I'm just kidding. I just say that when I bomb.
Florida's new abortion ban means that the majority of women in the South will have to travel more than 300 miles for the procedure. On the plus side, you can get free travel to New York by disguising yourself as a migrant.
A new poll shows that supporters of President Biden and Donald Trump are sharply divided over where they get their news from. People who support Biden are more likely to get their news from newspapers and mainstream media, while Trump supporters get their news from T-shirts.
Donald Trump also told supporters that if he's elected, he will focus on anti-white racism. Thank God. My people have suffered long enough.
Yes.
Sorry, Che, but time's up.
Oh, man.
I knew it was going to come out of you someday. Today was the 150th running of the Kentucky Derby, also known among horses as Squid Game.
Oh, I really like it. And I actually like this joke. I like Bill Maher's jokes in his monologue. Sorry, but he's got good writers. I think he performs them well. Others, many of you don't, and you can't stand the sound of his voice. But there's one joke about the Kentucky Derby, which I thought was funny.
So, I don't know if this interests you, but the Kentucky Derby is this weekend. Yeah, I feel the same way. But listen, this is pretty interesting. The winning horse will make $3.1 million. And the losers will be shot by Kristi Noem.
Yes, well done. I like that joke. So there you go. 48 minutes here to open an almost 90-minute show. I hope you have a long drive today. I've got a long conversation, I guess about 45 minutes with Ritholtz coming up. So I don't do this much anymore, but I was having a lot of fun putting the news together in my makeshift studio here at the National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. So peaceful and beautiful and quiet here. This is one of my happy places because I've been coming here for so long. So I guess I had the time and put in the effort. Like I said, you're going to see a lot of good stuff coming out of the show here moving forward. Can't do it without your subscription. Tell your friends that this is the most robust daily news recap that you're going to find anywhere in all of podcasts. I think that might be even pretty close to accurate in saying, but it's all curated by me here on Earth One. So certainly that's my editorial preferences, and I hope you appreciate them, but always want to know how I can do it better. The edit, the news, the story selection, all of it, any of it. So thank you. All right, let's get to my conversation with Ritholtz. We talk about money, economics, finance, housing, car, other markets, the stock markets, obviously, politics, government, all through a lens of the latest data analysis. One of the things I love about Ritholtz is that he always writes stories about what he got wrong, because it's not a perfect science, finance, economics, and everything that we talk about with Barry Ritholtz. He, of course, is the author of Bailout Nation and has a very popular blog, Ritholtz.com, where every day he posts great articles. You should subscribe to his newsletter that he sends them to you as well. The best reads of the week every day and even on the weekend. Ritholtz.com. Go subscribe to that for free right now. He's been doing it a long time and does a great job. He's the host of an awesome podcast on the Bloomberg Network. It's Masters in Business. Check that out. Follow him on Twitter. Bother him if you see him in person. Tell him I sent you. Lots to talk about with Ritholtz, and we taped this right before, on Thursday afternoon before the new job numbers came out, so we didn't touch on that. But I think we got to a whole bunch more. I think you're going to like it. I hope you let him know. Let's do it right now. Barry Ritholtz.
Hey, so you just got over COVID and economics and finance, and the question being asked right now by Trump, who's on the campaign trail, if he's not in court, and others on the right, is, were you better 4 years ago? That was 2020. And so you just getting over COVID and understanding where the economy was. Are we better off now than we were 4 years ago, Ritholtz?
So let's go back to May. I had it in March. By April, I was already recovering. In May of 2020, the entire country was locked down. We didn't have a vaccine. Unemployment had spiked to 15%. People were freaked out. Remember, we were washing our groceries. Yeah. No one had any idea of how this was going to come out. Surprisingly, the market teased it out. But by late March, it said, we'll figure this out. We'll get a vaccine. Human ingenuity is undefeated. And the market took off. And people had a hard time. I remember getting lots of emails and calls. I don't understand. Everything around me is closed. Why the hell is the market going higher? And you and I had that conversation. Your local dry cleaner, the dine-in restaurant, the retail shop, they're all doing, the local hotel, they're all doing terribly because people are stuck in their house. But when you look at what's driving the major stocks, it's all Paladin 4 years ago had hit all-time highs by December. Apple, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, the DocuSign, Teladoc, all these companies, Zoom, they were positioned to sell more of their goods and services when everybody was stuck at home. And so we had this real issue. My favorite thing about the first CARES Act, about $2.2 trillion under President Trump, was the week before, on a divided party line vote, like the most nonsensical thing, renaming a library in Washington, D.C., was voted down on party lines. And then a week later, I remember the NBA canceled the game that night and said, we can't put our fans or our players at risk. And that just was the big straw that cascaded, everything locked down, and people panicked. And it was literally the $2.2 trillion CARES Act one was the single biggest fiscal stimulus at 10% of GDP since World War II. So are we better off now than we were when we were in just absolute panic, terror, stuck in our house? Making matters worse, the idiot culture warriors arguing against vaccines, arguing against masks. It was just in time. All that said, we eventually figured it. And as long as you keep focused on the big issues, which is doing what you have to do to protect yourself and your family, getting the vaccines out there. I'm always astonished about the whole vaxxer thing, which started on the far granola left and migrated to the far right. Vaccines are a miracle. Hey, if you didn't want to get a COVID vaccine, if you don't want to be the first 1 million people or 10 million people or 200 million people, you could say, hey, it's new. But after a few years, when there's 15 billion shots out there, we know it is as safe as just about any other. And when you look at the death rates, the unvaxxed suffered much worse than.
I think COVID really broke Americans' thinking and trust, or broke it down at least more, deteriorated people's trust in institutions like the CDC and epidemiologists and so on, because people don't understand how science works and how you do your best to predict that a thing is going to play out, a virus especially, a certain way, and it may play out that way, it may not. It's not perfect. It's just not. But there were mistakes made and so on. But now we're dealing with the rise of a third-party candidate who was almost exclusively running on being an anti-vaxxer, RFK Jr. The fact that he has any fans, much less he used to be left, and so did all the rest of them, off on the sidelines in crank world. But now he's got I don't know what his following is. Apparently they shut down some kind of gathering this week because some of his staff was worried about radioactive waves or something in the venue they were going to be at.
Well, you got to be careful of radioactive waves, because vaccines are dangerous, but radioactive waves,
microwaves,
you can't go anywhere.
What do you make of his rise?
A combination of things. It'd be too glib to call it an amendment of the American education system that's too focused on tests and not focused enough on actually someone who's a very good test taker. The other thing that I find shocking is there is this rise, there has been this rise, and it's easy to blame Trump, but a lot of this predates Trump. When did Idiocracy come out? It's got to be like 10, 15 years ago. They were looking out into the future and seeing this.
The climate.
There's this aggressive, almost proud form of ignorance that's out there. And my favorite thing, one of my favorite things about investing in markets is, I'll quote Ray Dalio, the first job of investors is to recognize reality and figure out how to deal with it. If you're in fantasy world, right, if you believe a whole bunch of things that aren't true, depending on what those things are and how far off they are from reality, you're going to get spanked and lose a lot of money. The guys who wrote the book Dow 36,000, it came out about a month in 1999. Those guys were a laughing stock for a while. All right, one of them worked in the Trump administration. Another of them worked in the Bush administration. But still, in the world of finance, they became a joke, a punchline. And so you have to, it's not just true for investing. It's true for everything else. You have to bring a certain humility, and you have to recognize what you know and what you don't know. And to channel Rumsfeld, it's things you're aware of that you don't know, but it's the unknown unknowns. What do I have no idea that I don't know or that I'm getting wrong? Or where is a blind spot that could cause a problem?
Really good points. And it's always a question of critical thinking, and you always do a good job to teach us how to do that. Let's get into some of the issues that you think a lot about. For example, how do you think the economy is doing? What are you worried about? It seems the job market continues to be on fire and defy expectations, but interest rates are stubborn, and you've got a lot of thoughts about what the Fed should or should not be doing. But what is your overall look here as we speak at the beginning of May 2024?
So let's put a couple of things into context, because it's never a snapshot. It's never a picture. You got to look at the video. You have to look at the film to see how we got to where we are. In general, let's start with the labor market. In general, the labor market is strong, primarily because there is a shortage of workers, and there has been a shortage of workers over the past couple of years. You could really date it back to mid 2010s, but really, so three big factors have reduced the labor. One is just the number of legal immigrants coming into the United States with a green card, a work visa, an HB1 visa, some legitimate thing. I don't mean climbing under the fence at the Mexican border. Legal immigration, under 4 years of Trump, it dropped about 1 million people per year. Yeah. And then under the first year and a half during COVID of Biden, everything was shut down totally. So in 2020, we had almost no immigration, and the same in 21 under Biden, and really the first half of 22 before it started opening up. That's a big reduction of bodies for the labor pool. Second, back to COVID, you had 2 million people in the U.S., maybe more, die of COVID. When you look at working age population, that's 16 to 64, there's a lot of people who died who were in the working population. Plenty of people who were working are no longer with us. And so there's pick a number, 750, 500,000, whatever number you want to use. And then on top of that, there's been a big, steady increase in people going on disability. For the most part, pre-COVID, it was heavily tilted towards men. And disability could be anything. It could be long COVID. It could be injury. It could be addiction. It could be, there's lots and lots of things that allow you to leave your job and go on disability. Since the pandemic, women have been going on disability in strong numbers. They haven't quite caught up with men, but they've definitely moved in that direction. And it's surprising to see. That is not. So the labor market is robust. I just sent you a link to a chart that we used in our quarterly conference call that showed since COVID began in, let's call it February 2020, the cumulative increases in inflation have been about 20%. It's on a weighted basket of all the goods and services we consume. Wages have gone up 22%. And so you end up with a situation where everything costs more. We're all making more. Now, the rub is, and this is a whole nother conversation, 22% is the average. Lots of people didn't go up as much as inflation, and plenty of people, their wages went up much more than inflation. It depends on whether you're in what decile, what quartile of the earnings distribution you're in. On average, we're slightly better off. In reality, some of us are much worse off, and some of us are somewhat better. And that's why people find inflation so pernicious, so challenging.
Let's come back to inflation in a moment. And I want to see if you've changed, if you've moved at all about your thoughts about the organized labor movement. I think of you often anytime there's good news because you poo it a little bit, thinking that, and maybe you will, maybe you won't, maybe I'm wrong about that. But to see a automobile manufacturing plant in a right-to-work state, if you will, like Tennessee, organize and sign up with the UAW, it's major news. We're continuing to see organized labor grow and win from the WGA to UAW to teachers unions. There's a lot of momentum, and I'm not going to say that's why wages have gone up, but it usually is some correlation with the fact that working folks, organized labor, is working to create solidarity to get those wages up for themselves, and then everybody else has to try to compete with them, whether it be Starbucks or anywhere else.
Yeah, I don't credit labor unions. Less than 10% of U.S. workers belong to unions today. That's in the private sector. In the private sector, not counting. Let me double check that data. Is that? Let's go to the BLS union member page. 2023, the union membership rate, the percent of wage and salary workers who were members of unions was 10.0, exactly 10%. Over 2023. This includes public sector workers as well as education, training, library occupation, private sector. So this is everybody. So back when you go back to the 1980s, it was much higher than that. It was a very significant number. And in fact, if you look at how many union members there are in the United States, it's been on an upswing since 21. But go back to 2000, it's a little over 16 million. It bottomed at about 14 million in 2021. Now it's about 14.5 million. So it's fighting that trend a little bit, but it's 10% is still just 10%. Down from, where did it peak? Somewhere around half? Let me see if I can find that number.
When was that?
I want to say 1950, something like that. Oh. Union membership peaked in the 1950s at 1/3 of the workforce. Wow. God, you got to love U.S. Department of Treasury. And those numbers are post-World War II, right around, let's call that 47, something like that. Yeah, not a surprise. Almost 35% at its peak in the post-war years. And it's been a long, slow slide there. So, look, I'll give you to me, the biggest reason is just simply there's not enough bodies to fill all the jobs, right? And this is just basic supply and demand. If you have too few workers, the prices are going to go up, and the price for workers are the wages. By the way, when you have too few semiconductors to go into automobiles, the second largest consumer of semiconductors, the prices go up. And in fact, the crazy thing about the lockdown and the closing of the manufacturing plants, so we're not quite back to full capacity, but we're like 9/10 of the way there. The problem that we run into is right about now, all the cars that would have been bought in 2021 and sold on lease would be coming off lease and being up for sale as 3-year-old used cars. And a 3-year-old modern car is practically new. 2020, those cars should have been in the used cars should have been in the market last year. So we have a shortage of used cars. We don't have enough new cars. There are 90% there. So those prices have remained elevated. And because these prices are so much more expensive than they were due to the shortfalls, the insurance on these are much more. Now, it depends on what part of the country you live in. You go to Florida, they have just all sorts of crazy insurance problems. Some of it is weather-related, climate change-related, a lot of floods, a lot of hurricanes, a lot of storms. But generally speaking, the average new car price, I want to say, is about $44,000. That's much higher than it was a decade ago. And so your insurance goes up. And it's just vicious cycle of one shortage begets another shortage. And I've been talking about housing for forever. Following the construction peak of new single-family homes right before the financial crisis, homes peaked in volume in 2005 and in price in 2006. They tumbled. We were doing about 1.4 million new homes built a year. That tumbled to about 350,000 after the financial crisis. Right now, it's about 650,000. It's not even at the average of the past 30 years, which was about 800,000. You speak to the National Association of Home Builders or the National Association of Realtors, admittedly biased participants, but let's cut their number in half. They say we're 5 or 6 million houses short. All right, so let's say we're 2 or 3 million houses short. At 750,000 houses a year, it's still going to take 3, 4, 5 years to catch up to where we should be. And every day the population continues to grow. Most Western industrialized democracies have had a negative growth rate. We're about 332 million. 10, 15 years ago, we were 220. And we spent a decade of people just licking their wounds post-financial crisis. During the pandemic lockdown, lots of people said, oh, you know what? Maybe I should buy a house. And suddenly there was a surge in demand.
What role is private equity investors playing in residential real estate right now? How much is the market affected, retarded by private equity investors?
So it's a very sexy topic, and I think it's a little overblown. Some of the numbers I've seen have suggested it's pretty modest. Other numbers I've seen suggest it's more than modest, but not a whole lot more than modest. I had this really fascinating guy on Masters in Business podcast a couple of months ago named Sean Dobson. And Sean Dobson works for Amherst Holdings. They were a big buyer. They were a big seller of mortgage-backed securities leading into the financial crisis. They were one of the people testifying to the Federal Reserve, hey, you have a giant problem with mortgages here. You're just, not only are they priced incorrectly, we're giving mortgages to people regardless of credit rating, and this is a disaster. We've stopped buying a lot of your mortgages and begun selling them because of this problem. After the crisis really blew up in 2009, 2010, and I don't know if everybody operates the way these guys do. They're the good guys in private equity, and not all of them are. They went out and bought a bunch of houses that nobody would buy. They had these really, they've been using technology and AI very intelligently for a long time. So they said, we want to see houses that are relatively close to employment centers, to cities, to this, houses that we can buy relatively inexpensively, that we can repair and rent out to people regardless of their credit rating. And so they said when they went out and bought, I think they have something like 50,000 houses now. When they went out and bought these, they said most of the time they were the only bidder. And if they're not a buyer, the house just sits there. And it doesn't take that long for a house to fall apart if nobody's tending it. And he says we have, they offer an option to people who want to eventually rent to own. I'm not a defender of private equity. There's just too many things private equity does rapaciously, is a polite word. These guys seem to have done it in a way. They were on 60 Minutes, and they were pretty open when they were talking about, we went out and bought houses no one else wanted, and we fixed them up and rented it and buy us. We have a very specific set of rules, internal rules as to what we're looking for as a return. But we're also very happy to just rent them and keep being a good guy landlord, not a slumlord.
You think they're a good guy landlord? You think that they're receptive to the tenants' desires, needs, and issues? The private equity.
So that one shop that has been in real estate, like they're a real estate firm first, and they later on look like private equity. I suspect that's why they're a less egregious shop than the private equity firm that's looking around and says, hey, we got a ton of money. Where can we go rape and pillage? And real estate. Let's go kick grandma out of a house and sell it. I think it's two different things. The whole world wants to divide things into black and white, up and down, yes and no. And sometimes there's a little nuance there, and I try and be a little more open-minded. Because when I was younger, I was a Molotov cocktail thrower and just everything is corrupt, everybody is broken, this will suck. And you get a little older and a little grayer, and you realize it's a little more complicated than
I understand that,
so,
but like, I don't know. I wanted to ask you just about how the role that private equity venture capitalists are playing in trying to buy up basically entire industries and monopolize everything from veterinarians to dentists to doctors to food.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of that. The private hospitals that private equity isn't buying.
They're destroying everything.
Terrible. No, it's not. And the secret to making that work as a private equity firm is to buy off your local congressman. And you could lay all of this not at the feet of private equity, although clearly they're doing it, but for the Supreme Court that has legalized bribery.
That's a good point. Did you see?
And Citizens United is why everything is fucked. If you want to trace this back, why are these hospitals kicking people out? Why are these big in ProPublica today? Deny. It was the email to the doctor when someone comes in. Don't give them services. Don't give them drugs. We don't want to pay for anything. Personally, if it was up to me, I wouldn't go after the head of Cigna if these allegations prove to be factual. At a certain point, it crosses the line, and this is no longer a civil situation. Your reckless disregard for human health has led to people dying, and we need to prosecute you criminally. But I'm a hard ass. So
ProPublica, a doctor at Cigna said her bosses pressured her to review patients' cases too quickly. Cigna threatened to fire her. Cigna tracks every minute that its staff doctors spend deciding whether to pay for health care. Dr. Debbie Day said her bosses cared more about being fast than being right. Deny. That's how you hit your numbers, Day said. This is from the ProPublica investigation that you just mentioned, I think.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy.
I just interviewed this guy named Austin Frerick, who I think you would find fascinating. He's a Yale fellow, and he's an expert on agriculture and antitrust. So he's like the perfect guy to write this book. And he basically talked about these 7 different companies that own the world when it comes to food production, from dairy to cattle to everything else, to berries, you name it. Walmart's the biggest grocery store. And what his point is, today's capitalist doesn't believe in competition. They believe in owning the whole game.
That's right. When you look at who owns what food brands, it's a handful of companies, and it's a million brands: Pepsi, Nestle, Kellogg's, Unilever, Coca-Cola, Procter & Gamble, Mars. There's 12 companies out there that own 80%.
You got to have him on your podcast, Masters of Business. I insist upon it.
All right. You want to gig as my producer? You can start booking guests for me.
You got to book this one.
By the way, I keep sending you links to stuff because everything I mention is based on some data or some chart or some research paper that I read way back when.
Yeah, no, you're doing a good job. The 12 companies that own everything you buy.
Yeah, and by the way,
Nestle, PepsiCo, Coca-Cola, Kellogg's, General Mills, Mars.
Giving the FTC chair grief. Yeah, because she's doing all of these antitrust cases, but you can have it both ways. Either these companies should be broken up and they should be forced to compete with each other. And when inflation first spiked up, I did a post, the 15 causes of this current inflation. And like number 13 or 14 was greedflation. People were talking about these companies, they're taking advantage of all the chaos to raise prices. And at the time, I had seen no data that substantiated that. I'd looked at a number of quarterly earnings calls, and all I saw was a lot of complaining about input costs going up. And then over the next couple of quarters, suddenly the data started to surface, and it became clear a lot of companies were, hey, it's a very simple formula. Here's what we charge, and here's what the profit margin is, and where those lines cross is your optimal number. If we can make this much volume at this much price, that's our maximum profit. And companies started to realize, hey, we could raise prices enough. Our volume is going to go back, but we don't care. We're having a hard time during the pandemic getting our inputs, getting our raw materials to make this. So let's crank up the price and we'll sell 20% less, but we're charging 40%. More and more data came out. And when you looked at the tail end of 2021 into 2022, the profit margin in the biggest companies in the U.S., it was at record levels, but not just by a little bit. It had just widened dramatically. So it was pretty clear companies were taking advantage of the confusion and misdirection. And when everybody's raising prices, you can raise prices, no one's going to notice. What's funny, every now and then I will say, I like to get this gadget, but I'm just not going to buy it now. I'm going to wait. I'll see if it goes on sale. I'll watch the prices. There are things I replace pretty regularly on Amazon. And I watch, I got a reminder to get this set of dog toys for the boys for outside. So I always click and say, what did I pay for this exact toy last year? And for them, it depends on the toy. And you could see there was this definite surge in prices in 21 and 22. And a lot of these have started to come back down. Some companies, they just price their stuff. We want to sell a ton of this and we don't care about margin. But it's been, if I were redoing that list, I would move greedflation to, I don't know, 5, 6, 7. But
what would you,
it's fascinating.
What would you put? You mentioned greedflation, inflation. Obviously, news yesterday from the Fed, and not great news. How are you interpreting the announcement from the Fed chairman, Jerome Powell?
Sure. So the consensus was they wouldn't cut rates, and that's mostly because they're looking at the BLS data, which is dominated by shelter costs. And I put up a couple of really fascinating charts on the blog today. So there are real-time measures of rent, and then there is what the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out as the cost of shelter in their inflation measures. So it's rent of your primary residence, and that's true whether you own it or rent. It's lodging in hotels away from home. It's owner's equivalent rent, which is what you would pay to rent your own place. It's things like that. And it also includes tenant and household insurance. So again, another factor that has nothing whatsoever to do with Fed rates is, hey, by the way, Florida is something like 9% of the population in the country, but they're responsible for something like 2/3 of the insurance litigation over various claims. And some of it is just Florida, because Florida is its own crazy world. But a lot of it is you have this area, this whole state that doesn't believe in climate change, that's building right up on the water's edge. And Miami is a great example. It's not coming up and over the sides of the shore. It's coming up through the porous lime rock. And they have ongoing flooding problems, even when there is no hurricane, when there is no issue. So insurance is a problem. here's the crazy thing. In the way I'm going to take a really wonky topic and just make it really simple. 2/3 of apartment and home rentals that are signed are renewals, right? Only 1/3 are a new tenant moving into a new spot. And why is this significant? Because new tenants are showing rent year over year is essentially flat, right? You're looking back a year. The renewals, stop and think about it. If you're renewing your lease today, you signed that lease either a year or 2 years ago. So 2 years ago, if you're filling out your lease, what is the landlord going to ask for an increase if you renew it? It sure as hell 2 years ago was just about peak inflation. June 2022 was 9% peak inflation. That landlord 2 years ago wasn't asking you in May 2022. He wasn't asking you, hey, I'm going to give you this lease, and when you renew it, it's only going to be 1.5%. No, he's asking for a 5, 7, 9% increase. And if you sign that lease today, you could try and renegotiate it, but most people just don't. It's easier to pay the increase than to pick up and move. Right. And there's a chart we have showing here's what the new tenants look like, and those are the third of rental increases. Here's what the renewals look like. And that's a large reason why the Fed and the CPI data is so elevated. It's sticky because the model is not great. I love quoting George Box, British statistician and economist, who famously said, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And so all of this data is super useful, but in terms of depicting the universe, the world of price increases as it is today, it's not accurate. And the interesting thing is you could go outside of the government data and look at things like apartment listing index or the Zillow rental index. They've also come way down. And you throw that chart on the blog also because it's just so telling. When you look at the Zillow rents peaking 12 or 14 months ago, and you look at the apartment list index peaked at 17% in late 2021, it's negative for the past 5 months.
Wow.
That's telling you, hey, you're concerned about shelter. Now, here's the crazy thing. And this is what's so counterintuitive. And people, I love when someone on Twitter says, I share these charts and a lot of intelligent, worthwhile discussion. I had to block the guy who said, you are obviously retarded. Like literally, are we still using the R word? Are you even allowed to say that? No. Tell you what, I'm going to block you and let's just go our separate ways. So here's the really crazy thing. I mentioned the giant shortage of houses, and I linked to that in this piece if you go to Ritholtz.com today. We're spending almost $1 trillion a year building new residential homes. Would we be able to build more if mortgage rates were a little lower? Would there be more homes available for supply? The numbers that blow people's minds, right? 61% of all homes owned by individuals have a mortgage. Of those homeowners with mortgages, almost more than half, less than 2/3 with a mortgage, 79% have rates that are at or below 5%. There's about 60% at or below 4%. And so these people have golden handcuffs. They can't move. If you have a 3.75% mortgage rate, which is pretty close to the average for the Fannie and Freddie world of conforming mortgages, current rates are 7.5%. If your mortgage is $300,000 and you go from a 3.75 to a 7.5, your monthly payments go up by about 50%.
Yeah, that's not.
You go from $1,400 a month to $2,100 a month. Yeah. By the way, anyone can play with this. Just find a mortgage calculator, play around with it. The number of single-family homes that are available for sale are down 75% from their peak a few years ago. They were 4 million a year were available for sale. Today, it's only 1 million a year. Guess what? You reduce the supply 75%. Guess what's going to happen to prices? And by the way, if home prices have gone up, people who might have been starter home buyers, they're in the rental market. And so they're making that even tighter. So the perverse counterintuitive logic is if the Fed slowly starts to bring rates down, they're at 5.25. They don't have to take it down to 0 where it was, But if they bring it down to 4.5%, 4.25%, you'll see mortgage rates come down to the low 6s, maybe even high 5s. Lots of people with those golden handcuffs are going to say, you know what, we just had twins. I got to move to a bigger house, and now I could make it happen. Oh, and there's choices. It's not just that one house that fits our descriptions. For lower inflation, for lower shelter costs, the Fed needs to bring rates down. That'll bring more of these golden handcuff homeowners put their houses up for sale because they want to move. It'll make it less expensive to build more houses, and you'll take some of the people who are now apartment renters and they become home buyers. Right. And so everybody is better off. By the way, I have been banging this drum, I don't know, for about 2 years, and people have just been, oh, this is crazy. This is so, maybe a year and a half. No, this doesn't make any sense. Lower rates, lower inflation. When you follow it out, when you play it out, it's pretty clear the Fed, the way they use model data from the BLS, is a factor in inflation that I never had in my original list, other than they were very late to recognize inflation and very late to start raising rates.
Lastly, I want to ask you about oil markets. You've got a bit about that to share that may surprise some people. What do you want to say about energy, specifically oil producers, U.S. as an oil producer?
I do a quarterly call for our clients 4 times a year. And
that's what a quarterly call is. I think
quarterly, right? Quarterly 4. And I don't want to torment the same charts over and over, the same economic discussions, the same market discussions, even though they're so different. From quarter to quarter, there's a theme that you will notice every one of my appearances. There's certain threads that, so I always save a couple of charts for the end. Steve Jobs, one last thing. He used to say one more thing.
Right.
I used to go on Kudlow's show back when he was on CNBC back in the day, and I know he's right wing. Before he went crazy Trump nutty, screaming drill baby drill on Fox News now every day, I pulled up this data from the Energy Information Administration. The EIA is part of the federal government. The United States produces 12.9 million barrels a day of oil, making America the top oil producer in the world, and not by a little bit. About 30% more than Russia and about 33% more than Saudi Arabia. No one after them is even close. Canada is about half of Russia. Iraq and China are also about half of Russia. About 13 million barrels a day. This really started, ironically, due to the fracking technology. It really took off under Barack Obama. You didn't hear a lot about it. They didn't brag about it a lot. But when you look at the chart, the U.S. field production of oil has doubled since 2008. It was about 5.5, 6 million.
Yeah.
And here's the other thing. And everybody complains about this. Gasoline today per gallon is cheaper than it was a decade ago. The average price today for gasoline, all grades, is $3.60. A decade ago, it was $3.68. Now, you go back 20 years, it was cheaper. You go back 15 years, it was much higher. 20 years, it was like $2.50. 15 years ago, it was, remember when oil spiked to $150 a barrel? Gasoline was $4, $5, $6 during that surge. Gasoline prices are effectively cheaper than they were 10 and 15 years ago. It's the only good we purchase that is priced 10 feet high in 6 feet tall lit letters. So everybody notices it. But stop and think about it. How long has gas been $3 or $4?
Yeah.
Like it's most of your adult lifetime.
Yeah.
So the other thing that's fascinating about all this is when you look at what percentage of the household budget gasoline and energy is, it's cut in half in my lifetime. Like you go back to the post-war era, the 50s and 60s, it was over 5%. And then it started falling down. It spiked again during the oil embargo. It's down to 2.4%, right? You back out the COVID lockdown period when no one was driving. It's down to 2.4% of the average household budget. That is half of what it used to be. We are spending much less money on energy. We are spending much less of the household budget on food. And as pernicious and unpleasant as inflation is, when you look at the data, you have to recognize, every time stuff goes up, it sucks. Part of the reason inflation has gone up as much as it has is because wages have gone up as much as it has. And where you fall in that distribution is going to determine how terrible or tolerable it feels.
Right. We covered a lot. And
I know I was a wind-up toy today.
It was what?
I was just pull my string and I went off. I've had all this stuff in my head for a couple of.
That's what I like to do. I like to yank your cord.
Yeah, and off I went. The only other thing I keep telling people that I find shocking, every time I see, I am all about the data. Show me the data. And show me the track record of the person who is analyzing that data.
That's why we like
I'm pretty comfortable saying I've had a pretty good track record when it comes to talking about here's where the economy is at risk, here's where it's fine, ignore the doomsayers.
Not only that,
and the same thing on the market side.
Not only that, you publish at the end of the year everything you got wrong.
It gives me an excuse to snipe at other people if I don't say, hey, here's what I screwed up. And I was in team transitory. It took much longer for the supply chains and the semiconductors to come online than I expected. I jokingly said transitory took longer than expected. So I have to own up to that. I still think ultimately it proved to be right. It just took a little longer. But here's the thing. I want to just leave everybody with a moment of journalistic malpractice. And I've had this conversation with several journalists I know, both in print and radio and TV. So you have somebody come on the show and they show you a poll and they say, and I don't care if it says Biden is ahead, Trump is ahead. I don't care what poll it is. You have to ask these people 3 questions. And if you don't, you are committing journalistic malpractice. And the first question is, hey, it's fill in the blank. 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, a year before the election. How accurate are these polls? Where are we? It's May. The election is in November. All right, so how accurate are these polls 6 months out? And the answer is not very.
Right.
It's pretty much across the board. 6 months is a lifetime in politics. So many things can happen, and so many things will happen. And just go back and look at the polls a year in advance, 6 months in advance. Really, they start to become more accurate around 3 weeks, and their peak accuracy is 7 to 10 days. So when we're talking 6 months in advance, now, I'm not saying the people on any of campaigns should ignore these. I think the Biden administration has a problem with the youth. Not that I can imagine young people voting for a climate change denying, anti-woman's right, pro-life, anti-choice president. But if you believe the polls today, that's where they're suggesting, and I think those people, those administrations and those campaigns have to pay attention to that. That's the first question you got to ask is how accurate are we? Where are we today? It's May 2nd. How accurate are we 6 months? 6 months and 3 days out. The second question is, hey, we just had an election in 2022 and 2020. How did your polling method do at this point in the and how did you do 2 weeks before the election, a week before the election? And then the last question is, and how did your polling method do in 2016? Because in my field, when someone comes to my office or comes on my podcast, I always ask them, so how did you do last year? How have you done over the long haul? What about your process works or doesn't? Why should I believe that you weren't just lucky? Show me something that suggests that this is a repeatable process, not just, oh, you own Bitcoin when it spiked.
Right.
And you haven't done, there's a handful of portfolio managers who killed it in 2020 and have done crap before and since. To me, that sounds like it got lucky. When I see a polling person come on and the folks, and by the way, it's not just Fox, and it's MSNBC, it's CNBC, it's Bloomberg, it's ABC, it's NBC, it's CBS. When they sit down to talk to a pollster, I honestly believe it is journalistic malpractice if they don't ask those 3 questions. What's your accuracy 6 months out versus a week out? How'd you do in 20 and 22? How'd you do in 2016?
Yeah.
You got to ask those questions. Otherwise, pretty colors and numbers. what do they mean? If
it just generates more than anything else headlines. It's for media rather than in campaigns, I think.
The media can, so I'm working on a big project and I'm going through these really interesting notes and quotes I've accumulated and I'm massaging into shape. And I find this quote from this guy I forgot about. I read him like 20 years ago. And he said, a producer's job is to get their audience anxious. If they can make you nervous, if they can get you anxious, you're tuned in.
Yeah.
If they give you context and framing, maybe they're doing a good job journalistically, but they ain't getting views and they ain't getting clicks and their boss and they ain't getting bonuses. Right. And so people have to understand what motivates the people who are clamoring for your time, for your attention, and your money. Really important to stop and say, what is this person selling? What's in it for them? And why should I, first principles, why should I believe any of this stuff? A lot of it is garbage.
Very well said. Very well said. Couldn't agree more, being in the belly of the beast myself. Ritholtz, you've done it again. It's been too long. Let's not make it allow for it to be this long next time. Thank you very much, as always, for joining me, my friend. And
my pleasure. I hope I didn't bore everybody.
Never the case.
I went off and I went long.
He went off and he went long, and there he goes. There he goes off into the distance, the great Barry Ritholtz. Go tweet him, go email him, go say hello to Barry and let him know that you heard him here on the show. Always appreciate that. And so many of you do that. You can email Ritholtz at Barry@RitholtzWealth.com. That's Barry@RitholtzWealth.com. I hope a whole bunch of people email him, and thanks to Cindy for the idea to give emails out to anybody who allows me to do it, so that you can contact them for any number of reasons, but primarily, hopefully, to thank them for joining us and teaching us here in the classroom that I call Stand Up with Pete Dominick. So thank you for being a part of it with me each and every day. I look forward to talking to you again tomorrow from the National Conservation Training Center in beautiful Shepherdstown, West Virginia, a lovely little town. If you ever get down this way, you should definitely visit, come through, have lunch, or get out into the nature. If you love horses, beautiful part of the country for them, by the way. All right, I'm still talking. I don't want to say goodbye to you today. That's why I did such a long show. Thanks for listening. Thanks for your support. I'll talk to you tomorrow. John Carroll, take us away, brother. JohnCarroll.org.
On your fence, even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense, and you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town, just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down, boy, you better stand up, stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. Alright, we got to speak up, we got to reach up, and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside. And listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand